Hey, welcome to our first interview session of YLC. An opportunity for us to dive a little bit deeper into some of the things that we've been talking about. And our introduction is around stories. And so that's exactly where we're headed today.
Yeah, kid, I love stories because like stories are our experience and it's like our tale of our adventure, our journey of sense making in this world we call home. I think through stories we gain a deeper insight into the world around us. We learn about difference. We also learn about reality as other people experience it. Through stories, we also gain perspective. We learn about history and we develop an imagination for the future. Through stories, our God picture sort of unravels through our experience. And also through stories, faith and life collide into this alternative reality that pursues us as our picture of God envelops us. And so I'm so excited to have Ayanda with us today, who will help us to unpack stories a little bit more.
Thank you so much, guys, for having me. I'm super excited. I enjoy talking about myself and God and faith and culture, and so looking forward to this conversation.
I'm so excited.
That's so cool. We kind of needed to talk about yourself because we want to hear your story.
What? I get to do that?
And so instead of hearing from just Kiki and myself today, we want to hear from you. Who are you? Who is Ayanda? Who are we sitting with? Tell us who you are.
Name and surname. So my ID name is Ayanda Nxusani. I'm 27 years old. I was born in Cape Town. So I spent the first 5 years of my life in Kukuletu and then moved to Ekailija and then have been enveloped in suburbia over the last 10 years, sadly.
We can hear.
Stop. So I was raised in Ekailija and really just spent the most formative years of my life there. Schooling, primary, and then transitioned to varsity when I came to UCT.
What did you study?
Year. I studied politics and international relations and history. So I remember in matric telling my mom that I want to go into politics, and at the time the ANC Youth League was a big thing. So she was like, yes. And I'm like, no, Mom, I want to be like an analyst. And so I don't think she actually knows what I do even now, but she's very proud of me. I'm able to provide at home, but I don't think she can like explain to anyone what I actually do. But she has a student who's a graduate, a child who's a graduate, and so that's what I do. And then in terms of what I do now, I'm a master's student at UCT.
Sure.
Studying history, and my focus is on intergenerational trauma and South African youth. So my main obsession is around history and like how history informs how we interact with the world today, and particularly how ourselves as young people actually navigate the world around us because of our history. And so that's my side obsession. And then I do all other stuff on the side, which include having amazing conversations like this about stories and faith.
Sure. I think nobody better to share their story than someone who's so deeply connected with their own story. Just as before we get into some of our questions, if there was like one thing that you'd want young people to know about you that nobody else knows about you.
That nobody else knows about me. I think I actually figured this out when we got here, is that a lot of my image of the world and of God and of faith are actually informed by the traumas that I've encountered, which is really saddening because I think it's been such a heavy lens on my life. And so I move in the world as a Black woman, I move in the world as a Christian, I move in the world as someone who was raised by a single parent, I move in the world as someone who lived in a shack, who knows what poverty is, and so like all those sadnesses that I think can be like triumphant and like have the Black triumphing story of it really do inform the way that I move in the world, and inform how I see myself. And I think it's changing in small bits, but like, yeah, that's a big part of kind of how I move in the world.
Sure. That's such a good segue into an next
It's a bit heavy, but
such a good starting place and such a good launch pad. Because we're talking stories.
We are.
And one of the things that we've learned during our YLC journey is just how important geography is in our own story. And so maybe you can tell us how you've experienced your geography. You shared some of it, but maybe how that has informed your picture of God and how you see God.
Yeah. So whenever I say this, it always comes across as weird. I'm obviously Black, you can see. My name is Ayanda Nxusani. But I actually think I came to see myself as Black only when I came to this side of the world. So I lived at Ekailija in Kukuletu. December was filled with cousins and all the food and all the salads and all the noise. And I just like, I don't want to say I didn't know that I was Black, but my Blackness wasn't a big part of how I lived the world. I was a Xhosa girl mainly. And so I viewed God within that realm. I used to go to Methodist church on Easter. Methodist church on Christmas. I was baptized in Methodist church. Everything was black and everything was Xhosa there. And God was part of my story, but like not a big conviction. So I only got born again at 14. And interesting enough, when I got born again, I was going to a church, Kwalanga, which again was very black, but we spoke English. Sure. And so instantly how I speak about God moves to English because the church was like very local, but a lot of people who were coming, they were coming from the suburbs, like black people who had moved away from the township, but coming back to the township to come to church. And so at 14 until now, God is in English.
Sure.
And then when I moved to UCT in 2011 as a first year student, UCT was having some really great debates about the admissions policy, wanting to move away from race-based admission to class-based admission. And I remember it was in June and this one girl stood up at like one of the mass meetings. She was like, the color of poverty in this country is still black. And then I was like, well, am I black? And I'm like, am I poor? And am I the poor person that they're talking about? And I think that again completely shifted how I see God, because now I'm like, oh, I've been interacting with God as a poor person, and there are people who've been interacting with God as rich people. And so there's this line, and
Sure.
I'd been fighting, and I think still am, to transverse it and to move towards this upper middle class experience.
Sure.
But just that shift for me was both locational, where I moved to Rondebosch and I was living on campus, but also a shift in seeing myself as black and poor and on financial aid. And on, you know what I mean? All those things became such a big name in my story that hadn't been when I was living in Khayelitsha. And I'd say that there wasn't any markers of like what it meant to be black, but like blackness wasn't a big part of how I identified myself. It was very much being Xhosa and being a girl and living in Khayelitsha. And then just like, honestly, just crossing the rail line, I became black and now part of this emerging black middle class, right? Because now I have a university education and I have access to internet. And yeah, so I think that shift for me was locational, but also definitely like a shift in my own identity and therefore how I see God.
Sure. This movement, I think, is really significant because we unpack geography in our YLC course as not only being your physical location, you know, like your address, this is where I stay,
Right.
but actually geography also refers to your movement. And there's some places in the city, you know, that people just don't go. And there's some places that they always go to. And so there's a particular, like if you look at the map, there's like this hot spot, and this is your movement, you know. And I wonder how that develops your frame or your picture of who God is. And you spoke a bit about that right now. You spoke about December, like there was these moments that you know that helped you experience in the world. And so the question I would like us to think about is what has been some of the actions that has grown your picture of God? Or what has been some of the actions in your 27 years that's perhaps limited your picture of God?
There's something about economic access that just like changes how you see the world, right? So like I live in Kenilworth now, and even when I was as a UCT, anyway, so when I got to UCT, I lived in Res and we had washing machines and a dryer, right? And so instantly, like, I'm very aware that, like, oh, when I go home on school vac, I need to hand wash. And so I always have the story that, like, I'd gone home on, I think, with, like, March vac, and I had to, like, wash my laundry for the first time in, like, 3 months. And I had, like, a really bad rash. And, like, I spent, like, 18 years doing my laundry by hand. And so just that shift for me gave me access to this world that I'd been removed from. And I think as a Christian made me wonder why I hadn't had this world before, right? Like why was I doing hand washing my laundry? Why wasn't there a tumble dryer at home? And actually, like, why do my other classmates and peers have people who come fetch their laundry and do it for them at their houses in Constantia, right? And so instantly I'm exposed to like this other difference of Africa that I didn't have access to. And actually, like, had I not come to UCT, would never have known about.
Wow.
And so I think it was one of the first times where I really asked deep justice questions on my faith. Like, wait, like, why is there the analogy, like, why is there a church that has food every Sunday and, like, mine didn't? And, like, also being aware that the ways in which I had to perform affluence, being a UCT, just to make sense of the world that I've now entered into. And I think my image of God was hurt to some extent. Like, I was deeply offended by God. Like, this is actually a real thing. And like the white people that I'm hanging out with are Christians, in the same way that like the black people I was hanging out with also Christians. And I think I've actually fully recovered of that because I don't think I have, like, for me at least at the moment, there aren't any clear answers. But yeah, being aware of the access that I have by really shifting geographically, and that actually God is also found amongst these people, but the difference here is access to resources was really, really hard.
You said something really interesting, and I want to hijack the conversation, but you spoke about, like, you were really offended by God.
Yeah.
Like, you were hurt by God.
Like what?
Like, how do you, I mean, this conversation is being filmed in a YLC conversation that's like young people all thinking about our faith together and wrestling with our context. But that's a really significant thing you say. Like, is it okay for us to be offended by God? Like,
I would hope so.
How do you navigate that?
We didn't teach us that in Sunday school.
They really don't. Yeah. How do you navigate being offended by God?
I mean, I feel like offense is such a it feels like a natural experience, like a natural emotion, and I would be really offended that I can't be offended at God, if that makes sense. I think the offense came from, like, moving between, like, in March, June, September, December holidays, I knew that I was leaving the world of internet and washing machines to a different world.
Sure.
And, like, why is that, right? Like, that was a big thing for me. Like, I'm like, why is the world that I go back to Ekailecha not the same as this? And this is, like, really the same Cape Town. And I think being a politics student, there was obviously, like, a historical language for that, like injustice, apartheid, history. But why? Like, why did apartheid happen? Why did it resolve in this way? Why are Black people always at the bottom half of the list?
Sure.
And then I think the other part that was most difficult was that, like, a lot of the people who upheld apartheid laws were Christian. And so how were they making sense of this God whom is loving and generous and is the creator of all things and creates good creation in humans? But there are those who have to have access to Wi-Fi and those who haven't. And I mean, Wi-Fi is, like, a very simple
Of course.
and silly example. But again, like, access to resources. And that really offended me. And I think it's been the reason why I've been vehemently fighting for justice in these different spaces that I enter into. But yeah, offense is definitely part of it. I would hope that I'm allowed to be offended, because then it would feel that my relationship is inauthentic with God.
You loved geography in a city that is so divided, and so you've encountered difference in those different spaces. How do you deal with difference?
I consider myself a very nuanced person. So I think difference for me has been most expressed through food. I love eating chicken feet, guys. Like, any day, give me a bowl of, like, good chicken feet, good, just, like, healthy, well-cooked tripe. I also really enjoy, like, I love tripe. Like, I really enjoy a good plate of sushi and, like, a nice white glass of wine. And so for me, like, I love both those worlds, right? And I'm both those people who, on one I can, like, be really craving umpharoqo or umngqusho or anything else, and also be like, I'm really craving, like, a good steak. And I think I've just, like, embraced it because of the type of person that I am. There's parts of me that really conflict. And so being uMxhosa, and loving Xhosa tradition, and also being Christian, and I know that Christianity, parts of it calls ubuXhosa bam, my Xhosaness, offensive to faith. And I think I live in that contradiction daily. It isn't simple, and it's most expressed when I have to make a decision. Like, do I go to this family traditional ceremony? Do I cast out a demon, or do I have my families actually participate in heritage? And it feels like a trial and error every day.
Sure.
So I live in it, and I think I embody it. Because I love staying here. I love the comfort of Kenilworth, but I also love the feeling of home and the nostalgia that I feel when I go home. And I hold both of those in my body.
Sure. We also speak about this city that we live in, right, as being a space that's often maybe contested, you know. You spoke about having an experience of the city with washing machines and internet, and then having in the same city an experience without washing machines and internet, as an example. And so there's often these dividing lines. You spoke about the railway as being a dividing line, really.
Right.
And there's these bold, dividing lines across our city, and it's a result of our history. We know that, we know that this is part of the remains of that we live with every day. But what has been your experience of seeing moments of, I guess, redemption, restitution, reconciliation as you navigate and move through these spaces?
I know that for me, I hold very dear both of my realities. So like the 17-year-old Ayanda who left Ekailicha to come to UCT, and the 10 years that I've spent on the side of the railway. And the church has been like a really big part of like just restoring that. And again, like you can find churches that feed into the division, or you can find communities that honor that, and like actually there really is neither Jew nor Gentile. And so come, let's eat at the same table. So I think I've seen those spaces. Art has been a really big part of that. Like art spaces in Cape Town remain exclusionary in a lot of ways, but like there's parts of like town where you're seeing painters from Ekailicha, Kukuletu, Kwalanga, and like art has been a really sacred space for me to see that interaction. Music, so I think creativity and the arts feel like they've been such a meaningful prophetic voice into what can be. And so like multilingual writers and different worship instruments in churches are like a big part that like was saying, hey, we can actually come together across these lines. And then Sunday morning can actually be a space that's very redemptive, and like the space that I've entered into on Sunday morning or like in church spaces have been a really meaningful attempt to like bridge that. Even if we can't do it systemically, we can at least do it symbolically. And for now, maybe that is also okay.
Yeah. There's also a lot of sort of suspicion, should I say, in the city. You know, like the city operates under that suspicion, whether it's politics or whether it's church, you know, whether it's community. There seems to exist this suspicion.
Yeah.
Now, if we were to suspend suspicion for 1 year, right? Say we were deciding that suspicion was suspended for 1 year in the city of Cape Town. What do you think that city will look like? How will it operate?
God. So earlier on, before we started filming, we were speaking about a friend of ours who was very committed to like the homeless community in Cape Town. And I think of like the suspicion that we feel when we think about we have buildings in the southern suburbs that are like empty for 6 days in the week, right? And are only used for 3 hours on Sunday. If we weren't suspicious of like poor, homeless people, we would house them for those 6 days. And so I think we wouldn't have a homeless crisis in South Africa, in Cape Town. Guys, we're in COVID, and so like there's been like 5-6 months of like home insecurity for a lot of people, and church buildings are empty. Sure. And so if we weren't suspicious of the poor, we wouldn't have a homeless crisis. I think that's one. At a personal level, I think I would also just have like a way more diverse circle of friends, because I see you as, unfortunately, when I see someone who's white, there's the initial response of like, oh, they probably are. And they have to say the right things to me for me to be like, oh, okay, cool, I can like let my guard down here. And so I think if that was removed, we would really just see each other as humans, and intentionally move across each other's rail lines, actually, and come across. I think our suspicions drive our anti-poor, anti-black, anti-other beliefs. And if those were removed, oh my God, what? Yeah, I think the homelessness thing is actually something that's like very big in my head at the moment. I think as a woman, like I'm assumed to just like not have any financial literacy. And so I'm sure you'd see like way more financially free women if we were trusted to handle money and we trusted to like interact with finances in the country. How money is distributed wouldn't be so gender unequal, because I'd be trusted as someone who can handle money and actually has the capacity to engage with finances the way that men are assumed to do, without even questioning it. Homelessness and financial freedom.
I really like what you said about homelessness and the church's buildings being opened. I think that's such a practical thing for us to consider during this time.
Yeah.
What is our faith communities offering in the midst of a COVID crisis? And that kind of leads us into our next question. You've got a very rich experience of the city. And one of the things we're wanting to do at YLC is to kind of develop leaders who have a love for the city and who's faithful to the city and faithful in following Jesus in the city. So what does that look like for you? What does it mean for you to follow Jesus faithfully in Cape Town?
I once heard an analogy about how religion looks like across different contexts, and they'd use McDonald's as a case study. So McDonald's, there's like the Happy Meal, there's the quarter pound or whatever. Big Mac, and you know all those things because you know.
I have no idea. I absolutely no idea.
I'm not even gonna.
But it's like in
No, you
different parts of the world, they'll have like a special thing that's like authentically Indonesian, authentically Thai.
Boerewors burger.
Right, you
Is
know
that
what
a
I
thing?
mean?
Yeah.
That was a thing, and then they stopped
Boerewors
it.
Boerewors
burger.
Yeah, then they just is it still there?
I think it's still on the menu. I mean, I
Yeah.
haven't been there in a few days.
Right. But like part of it, like that the McDonald's is very aware of context, right? So like it has its core belief, the Big Mac meal and the Happy Meal, which I enjoy, but it's also very willing to like contextualize and adapt. And so I think for me, like serving Jesus faithfully in the city is honestly being aware about what the city is, right? Like Kenilworth comes from a particular history of segregation. There were families who moved, black families who moved from here to go to Ocean View, to go to Kailicha Kukuletu, and so forth. So like knowing the history and the violence that people have experienced in the Kenilworth area means that like Jesus must speak to that. Jesus can't only speak to my 2020 experience of faith. Serving him faithfully is being aware about like what is the pain in the city, what is the violence in the city, why are people hurting, where are people hurting, how are they hurting, and if my faith doesn't communicate that like Jesus cares about the homeless, being mindful that like guys, Mary was like a refugee. She like legit was like sleeping in a shack while she gave birth to Jesus, running away from like a tyrant dictator, right?
Sure.
And so it's like Jesus himself is born in this like moment of injustice, and to be like, when I see a homeless woman who has a baby, like what was that experience like? And Jesus, serving and following Jesus faithfully means being very attentive about the context that he was in, historically and politically, and therefore I can't ignore my context. And so the homeless thing is that like there are babies who are raised by homeless parents or being born over the last 6 months, which is an experience very similar to Mary and Jesus and Joseph, who were like really refugees and homeless at the time. And so I think serving Jesus faithfully for me in part looks like understanding the context, the hurt, and having Jesus speak into that. And so like, daughter, stand up. You know, like the church becomes a prophetic voice where we say, stand up, come sleep in a bed actually, come have a warm meal, let me restore you back into dignity.
Sure.
Like, yeah, just like the image of like Jesus saying like, woman, stand up, you know, like, and I'm lifting you up in dignity, because I know that you have fallen and the world has contributed to you being discouraged and on the floor, but I'm calling you to stand up. And that isn't just like metaphorical, it's that like, and I will give you a bed, and I will give you a meal, and I will train you to have a job. Feels like I think that's one of it.
I really like that. I also, like how you speak about faith is really beautiful, but I know that this is not the normal way in which we think about faith and following Jesus and what that may look like and how that's expressed. And I was struck by a conversation I was watching the other day. It was actually around race, and somebody remarked just about like, if we don't work out who we are in dialogue with that which is different, that we may find ourselves in trouble again. And then she spoke in particular about race, but she also spoke about faith, like to work out your faith in dialogue with somebody who's Muslim or Jew is really helpful in understanding what it means to follow Jesus. I was really struck by that comment though, because I certainly wasn't reared, in my community to think about maybe my sort of journey into faith in that way. It was definitely very protected. And then to hear that comment was like mind-blowing for me. And so, thoughts, like what do you think about that statement, one? Or two, like who are you theologizing with? How is your faith seeking understanding, and with who are you doing that?
So I'll answer that in two different parts. I think one, particularly for Christians, right, racism, sexism, classism, all the isms are important, and we name them because we have the language and we have the sociology to name it. But I think personally, it's a creational defunct. Like, if I can look at you, Keenan, and believe that you're made in the image of God, but that image must be homeless. That image needs to be imprisoned because of the color of your skin. That image brings suspicion. Then at the core of it, as a Christian, I don't actually believe that God creates good human beings, right? Like you are a good creation because you're colored, and I'm a good creation because I am black, and you're a good creation because you're white. And so the moment like all the isms enter in, what I'm saying to you is that like you're not a good creation.
Sure.
And you're not deserving of human dignity as a good creation. And I think that's a big thing for me, where like, I think there is a temptation to like not name them as racism and whatever, and I can sympathize with that. But if you're going to name it as something, it has to be sin rooted in a misunderstanding of creation. That's one part. And in terms of like theologizing within diversity, it becomes so important, because what I'm saying to him, like, Keegan, there's a mystery of God in you.
Sure.
That I need to, in order for me to have a fuller picture of God, I need to know who you are. And see this particularness about God that he put in you, right? And if I don't do that, I've missed the part of God who God is, right? Because I don't see you as a good creation. And so I think that's why, for me, reading scripture in diversity is so important, because it's not just about like reading it with like a black person, a white person, a colored person. It's about reading with like different mysteries of God in these people. And so I become poorer as a Christian if I'm only reading with black women.
Sure.
Even though black women enrich me and develop me in the most beautiful and healing ways, I have to read it with you, because it's a mystery that God has put in you that he hasn't put in me. And though we need each other. And so I find myself I think I really intentionally seek out diverse spaces with friends, with strangers, online. Online is like a very toxic but very good space to like meet different opinions. And I hope that at the core, but I'm just like, I'm reading this Bible verse with you because it can't land the same way. The verse that says, blessed are the poor, will never land the same way to me now at 27 in Kenilworth. And I read it very differently when I was 16, being food insecure at home. And so I think when I am aware about my changing economic mobility as a black woman in this country and my changing personality, I need to always be seeking out other and asking the question, like, who am I excluding in my thinking patterns? Because who I'm excluding is a part of who God is. I think, I don't know, like, that's such a big thing for me right now. Like, I think exclusion isn't about, like, politics only. Yeah. It's about excluding a part of who God is in people. Sure. Yeah. And actually saying that, like, you aren't worthy of God's mystery. And that's so sinful. And so, that's what diversity is for me. And so if you don't want to name it as racism, that's your own prerogative. It feels like a denial, but it's fine. But then let's name it for what it actually is theologically, that this is a denial of human dignity and a denial of God's mystery in someone else, purely because they're different to you.
Sure, exclusion.
How weird.
I know exclusion is excluding a part of who God is.
And it's sinful.
What?
I like that a lot. Yeah. Ayanda, thank you so much for being with us today. I really found this conversation very liberating. And beautiful. It's amazing to hear your story and to hear how you are theologizing, making sense of faith in a city like Cape Town. How your movements have impacted you and also shaped your picture of God, and how your picture of God is growing and growing and growing and growing. And so thank you so much for being with us today. I'm sure that all those who are tuning in will really find this conversation very helpful.
I hope so. The one thing that I do want to say though in like closing is that like even as a black woman, I know that I also have the capacity to exclude, right?
Of course.
And so I think when we look at identity and personality, it can be like a hierarchy thing. But even at the bottom of the bottom, in the power hierarchy, there's still the capacity to exclude. And so like, even as a black woman, I'm constantly having to be sharpened by others to say, actually, Ayanda, your theology is very woman and excludes queer people, right? And like, what are the ways in which I reach out to a queer community and say like, hey, how do you theologize your faith as a queer person? Or white people, right? Like, I'm like, I don't read white theology at all because I'm just like, I'm not about that. But it's like, actually, like, what is God doing here in this community? And what am I excluding in the same process? And so it's easy to be the only one who's excluded, but I also can have the proclivity to also exclude.
Of course.
And to just be aware about, like, the ways in which my shifting identity also propels me to exclude.
Yeah.
Thank you. You've given us a lot to think about. You've given us a lot to kind of digest. And we're hoping that as we continue this journey together, that would be our posture. That it would be one of learning, one of wanting to lean in, and then allowing these stories to impact our faith and to impact our lives as we journey towards becoming faithful leaders within the city of Cape Town.